Good evening and welcome to Valley Beth Shalom Live. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein, and it's a delight to welcome you to this very special program in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, in commemoration of the day we remember the Holocaust and the horrors and the courage of those who survived. Tonight we welcome a wonderful author, Barbara Stark-Nemon, who's going to be sharing with us a story. And to introduce tonight's program, please welcome Debbie Goldberger, who's president of our sisterhood.
Thank you, Rabbi. Erev Tov, everybody. And as the Rabbi said, my name is Deborah Goldberger. And as current president of Sisterhood and host of this program, we thank you for joining us on this important day, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this day, we remember those who perished at the hand of terror, and we commemorate the heroic survivors and the righteous helpers. I hope you are healthy and well, given our unprecedented times. Thank you to my Sisterhood board, and especially programming chairs, Claudia Wenger and Eileen Kramer, who put this program together with the help of Debbie Alden and others. It is an honor to welcome author Barbara Stark-Nemon to share the story of heroism and survival of her great aunt. Following Barbara's presentation, Rabbi Feinstein will lead a Q&A with Barbara. Stay well and never lose faith and hope. We are all survivors. As Barbara poignantly writes in her book, Even in Darkness, her great aunt remembered the first time she heard Leo Beck's recitation of the Shehechianu, an explanation while they were in Theresienstadt, that even in the camp, there are occasions to mark with thanks. It was the first time, she writes, that her great aunt had understood the power to mitigate life's setbacks with gratitude and blessing that was inherent in the faith of her forefathers. She was then able to embrace the contradiction of, and the key to her survival, the parceling of pain and hope. Her aunt later said that all the losses filled her heart alongside all that remained to be lived and loved. Debbie Posner now, who brought Barbara to us, it's her cousin. She brought her to our attention and helped facilitate her appearance, will now introduce Barbara to us. Enjoy the program.
I've long looked forward to introducing my Ann Arbor cousin to all of my friends and fellow congregants of Valley Beth Shalom. It is especially fitting she should be here now to tell her great Aunt Claire Kohler's story. It harkens from very dark years of the Holocaust, the losses for which we memorialize tonight on Yom HaShoah. My cousin's love of stories and her talent for telling them led her to her encore writing career. After many successful years as a speech pathologist, Barbara has written 2 books and is currently working on her 3rd. Even in Darkness is her first. I am proud and honored to introduce our distinguished guest author, Barbara Stark-Nemon, together with our own beloved storyteller, Rabbi Ed Feinstein.
Oh, gee, thank you so much, Deb. And thank you to Rabbi Feinstein and to the Ilanas and to Orit and everyone who's helped me get ready to appear tonight. I'm going to try right now to switch to screen mode. So people tell me if it's working or not, because I am new to the Zoom world of presenting.
Hello.
Can you see the slide? No. Okay. Well, let's try it again. Okay, there we go. All right, you should see a single slide. You see 2 slides. Okay. You see 1 slide or 2?
We see 2 slides, Barbara, just like before.
Okay, so let's use slideshow. How does that look?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right, thank you so much to all of you. So we're gathering tonight for Yom HaShoah in all over the world. The legacy of that terrible time is being recalled and spoken about and thought about. And we're all wearing a little bit thin with the isolation and worry about coronavirus and about our political world. And I briefly wondered how focusing on the Holocaust could be at all helpful for the moment that we are in. And I have to tell you that my own Jewish world has changed dramatically in the years since I published Even in Darkness in 2015. The rise of anti-Semitism, of authoritarian governments all around the world, and unfortunately in our own country, has brought home to me a sense of vulnerability in a way that I couldn't have imagined being a child of the stable 1950s and the idealistic 1960s. In March of 2004, I had to include an insert in the invitation to my youngest son's bar mitzvah that I had not had to put in his older brother's invitations. The brief note explained that as congregants and guests entered that very special day, they would encounter protesters on the sidewalk carrying extremely offensive signs like Israel, no right to exist, and Zionism enabled Nazism, and you pray for genocide. The protest began because the congregation would not remove the Israeli flag from the sanctuary or allow the group's leader to speak in front of the entire congregation. That was in 2004. In 2013, after the death of my father, I wrote the following to my children. Although I go to services and say Kaddish every day, I have found it lonelier to do that. The protesters have particularly horrible anti-Israeli and anti-Semitic signs on Shabbat. I go to services to mourn my Holocaust surviving, humanity-loving, open-minded Jewish father and have to confront these hateful protesters. It's extremely painful and dignity stripping. That was in 2013. It's now 2020, and those protesters, up until coronavirus, were still there every Shabbat morning. And that's just at my synagogue in Ann Arbor. We all know about the shootings, the raging on the internet, the need to place guards in our religious schools, and the emptying out again of Jewish communities in Europe. So this was my mindset as I had to ask myself, what do I have to offer you all this evening in the face of these circumstances? And the answer is, in the tradition of our people, of my forefathers and foremothers, I have a really good story. I was inspired to write my first novel based on my great aunt's life precisely because her story of Holocaust survival was all about the victory of love and devotion and resilience over pain and horror. So I thought, what better time to bring Even in Darkness to you all than on this particular Yom HaShoah. So I invite you to hear the story behind the story, and I hope you'll come away with the conviction that even in dark times, there are sources of light and inspiration, or at least an interesting diversion. So let's get to it. My mother's family, which is the family of origin for this story, escaped Germany 3 weeks before Kristallnacht in 1938. Most of my father's family remained in Germany at that time, and those who eventually escaped didn't get out into 1939. As the child of not one, but two German families who immigrated to the US in the late 1930s, I grew up with family stories of the Holocaust that were a little bit different from my other Jewish friends. Both my parents' families had escaped the Nazis and were deeply, deeply grateful for their American citizenship and the lives that they rebuilt here. My parents had met at a refugee self-help dance. They married and their extended families became founders and supporters of their synagogues, and they were active members of our Jewish community, but they also traveled to Germany. They did business there. They spoke German among themselves, and they had friends, both Jewish and non-Jewish, that were German. Even stranger, my grandfather's sister, Clara, who did not escape Europe before the war and spent 2 years in the concentration camp Theresienstadt, never left Germany after being liberated. For 40 years, she lived as a Jew, caring for a Catholic priest half her age in Germany. Now, I came to know and love and be deeply inspired by this aunt and the priest and the fascinating life that they had with each other. And it's their story that led me to write Even in Darkness. The author Stephanie Feldman says that our ancestors came from Europe and their history has been lost twice. The war destroyed the communities that they came from, and their own stories get lost in successive generations of assimilation. And I've certainly become fascinated with the legacy of the Holocaust in the fiction of second and third generation to those victims and survivors. But my relative stories were not lost to me, in great part because my grandfather was a master storyteller. As a child, I stayed at the dinner table long into the night. If my grandfather got going on stories of his childhood, of the town he lived in, his raucous uncles, his sisters, and his service as a soldier in World War I, and eventually of his life in Berlin as a high-powered attorney. He was not only a master storyteller, he was a storytelling mentor. He actively cultivated that skill in all his grandchildren, and he encouraged, in fact, he demanded that we tell him really good stories about our everyday lives, and he never failed to notice when we got it right. So nota bene to all you grandparents out there, your stories and the stories of your grandchildren have a lot of power. I first met Clara when I was 4 years old during her first visit to America, and that's an event that I kind of dimly remember in the haze of cigar smoke and long dinners and lots of bottles of wine and German conversation that characterized a lot of the time that I spent at my grandparents'. I loved Clara from the moment I met her. And as I grew older, her life in Germany seemed to be a mystery. Why did she stay there when the rest of the family were in the United States and in Belgium and in England? And why was she living with a Catholic priest? In later years, Clara visited several more times for significant family events, and I became familiar and devoted to the priest who's the basis for the character Ansel in Even in Darkness. I began to travel to Europe, and often with my grandparents, and I never went without stopping on one side or the other to visit them or arrange for them to join us. And over those many visits, I learned Clara's and Ansel's stories of their childhoods, of the war, of loss, and of survival. And I found that across the years and the language and the continents and the culture, that each of them offered astute counsel and a fascinating perspective that was really different than my own. Understanding the particular story of Clara's life kind of became an obsession of mine at a fairly young age, but only in the writing of Even in Darkness did it become clearer to me that in understanding her life and telling her story, I would reach an understanding of my own relationship to my family's history in Germany and to the Holocaust. to honor the complexity of the choices that she had to make, to pay homage to my grandparents who lost everything and then refound everything in this country, to memorialize other family members, and most importantly, to celebrate the legacy as I experienced it, or what I needed to weave into a book. And there was more to consider in writing this book. Remember that both my parents escaped Germany in the late 30s. My father's grandmother, Carolina, and her brother, Max, died in the same concentration camp to which Clara was sent during the time that she was there. And though I never knew them, I knew their stories and the great impact that they had on my father, and I wanted to memorialize them. So how did I decide what the essential story would be? About 2 careers ago, I stood in front of this painting in Clara's dining room in Germany. And the painting was a little out of character in her otherwise very serene and lovely room. And I asked her about it. And her eyes got kind of dreamy. And she described the time shortly after World War II when she had purchased it. She saw those flowers struggling to emerge from a dark background in the painting as a metaphor for her own life. She had survived 30 months in a concentration camp, more months in a German displaced person camp, and the loss of many of the loved ones she had fought to save during the Holocaust. She was a middle-aged Jewish woman who had just come to live with a Catholic priest. So I knew these basic facts from my grandfather's storytelling, but in her telling it, I understood in a different way what the complexity and the impact of that story was. I could feel the warmth of her childhood memories, her exhaustion and the sorrow of the horrors that she experienced during the war years. But I also saw her face light up when she told about coming to live with the young priest and the joy that their very unlikely relationship had brought to each of them. As she described what that odd painting meant to her in its call for survival and resilience and the promise of beauty, I was overwhelmed with admiration and respect for her ability to unerringly find the half full glass. So I asked her, how do you do it? Like, how are you always able to find joy and meaning in your life? And how can you forget all of that pain? I never forget, she told me, and her eyes drilled straight into mine. The mouth laughs, but the heart cries. In that simple, stunning sentence, my life changed. I understood in a new way that fully accepting a painful past is not mutually exclusive with finding a full and meaningful life in the future. And I knew that I had a book to write. So there were 9 years between the time that I stood in front of that painting with Clara and when I decided to retire from my full-time job as a speech and language therapist and teacher to write Even in Darkness. All that time I was researching, traveling to Europe, to Theresienstadt, to Israel, to Yad Vashem and the kibbutz in Yechiam, and to Germany to interview Clara and Ansel. There was no question that the essence of the story for me was Clara, her early life, her marriage, her children, the fact that she had to send them out on the kinder transports, and then what happened to her during the Holocaust. The priest's story and Clara's, the life that they created with each other also wouldn't let me go. And I realized the book really belonged to those two. And my job was to create some meaning for the reader through the narrative about them. And since the top item on my bucket list was to write a novel, I decided to write this book as a novel. By this time, Clara had died at the age of 100. 3 months after her death, I inherited all of her personal papers, including letters that her son wrote to her when in 1945, the Red Cross let him know that his parents had survived the camp and were in a displaced persons camp. He was in Palestine. I had notices for Clara to report to the laundry in the concentration camp. I had letters to Clara from my young mother and my grandparents, who by then were living in Detroit. My biggest job was to translate the nearly 100 letters that were written by Clara's son, Werner, from the time that he found out as a pioneer in Palestine that his parents had survived. To read these letters from this 18-year-old favorite cousin of my mother's with his description of his escape as a 12-year-old from Germany and the years of his life half a world away through the war and his leadership in this new kibbutz that he was starting was both fascinating and did more than anything else to make his character live for me. He tries to counter the exhaustion and the desperation and the heartache of his parents who had just survived the Nazis with his youthful assurance that someday it would be safe for his mother to come and see him in Palestine, brushing off the dangers that he faced and writing all his exuberance for what he and the others on the kibbutz were training to accomplish. He sounded so much like my own sons at that age, full of the adventure of his life and protecting his mother from full exposure to the risks that he was taking on a daily basis. I cannot overemphasize the impact of those letters, and later on my visit to Israel, to the kibbutz that he lived in, to my sense of what it meant to my own family to have gone through the Shoah. My immediate family was safe and sound in America. Clara was in devastated Germany, and her sons in a strife-torn settlement in Palestine and in England. How can this known history not have changed the way that I think about the world? And here was a letter from my great-grandmother, Johanna, written to her 3 other children who were not in Theresienstadt with her, written on a bread wrapper from the concentration camp when she worried correctly that she would never see her other children again. I had in my hands this bread wrapper with tiny, sometimes illegible script in which she wrote her heart out to the 3 siblings, including my grandfather. First, she writes about her lodgings in the town, what it looked like, and the fact that a building that was built for 70 people now housed 600 people. And then she writes, and this just broke my heart, today on my birthday, on the 21st of November, I feel closely attached to you. You must feel it, dear children. You are my luck, my good fortune, and my joy. My thoughts circle between Theresienstadt and Brussels and Detroit. Pray for we 3, as I always pray for you. Reading this letter and reflecting on Clara's unwillingness to leave her mother and her sick husband that resulted in her internment in the concentration camp and the devastating choices that she had to make to keep them alive had an enormous impact on me. Her courage and strength in saving them changed the way that I think about my own life choices and our capacity to do more and be more when a situation calls for it. Well, more than 100 letters later, I had about 4 books of material. I had the fascinating story of Clara's other sister, who was hidden by nuns and a priest in a convent in Belgium. I went several times to Theresienstadt in the Czech Republic, where I found more information about other relatives and about Clara. And on a roots tour to Germany with my parents and my siblings and my children, we went to Theresienstadt and we saw this drawing that you see on the left done by an inmate at the camp of a woman who worked in the laundry, which Clara did do. Both my brother and I are certain that it's a drawing of Clara. So anyone who's ever written a historic novel will have tales to tell about research digressions. And one of mine was learning about Jewish soldiers in World War I. It turns out that not one, but both of my grandfathers served as soldiers in World War I for Germany. Ernest, on the right there, Clara's brother, left law school and went to fight and was very proud of that service and the medal that he received, which was unusual for a Jew. Never mind that it was the German army or that this hard-won Iron Cross First Class medal did not keep him and his family from having to escape with his life from the Nazis 2 decades later. He fought for his country in the Great War as a Jew and as a German. It's still hard for me to imagine that any young Jewish man would join the German army, but they did it in droves. My own grandfather left his legal studies, but then went back to them at the University of Munich and later practiced high-powered law in Berlin for 20 years. Then he escaped Germany and eventually was readmitted to the German bar in order to help Jews to secure restitution from the German government. As a proud American and a practicing Jew, he never lost his pride in that World War I military service or his identification as a German. So my family didn't hate all Germans or anything German. This duality, which allowed them as refugees from Nazi Germany and practicing Jews to also proudly embrace their heritage as Germans, seemed not to bother them at all. Well, it bothered a lot of other people, especially in the Jewish community that I grew up in, and it created many uncomfortable moments for me as I grew to realize that others did not approve of my family's connection to Germany. More than a few of my friends' families rejected anything and anyone having to do with that country. Navigating these different responses within and outside my family became a subtle skill set that I had to learn. Getting to know Clara helped me understand how to navigate all of that. All my life, I'd heard my grandparents and others describe Clara as lucky. Really, even though her life in Germany was circumscribed by 2 world wars, having to send her children away, time in a concentration camp, an unimaginable loss, until I had to write her through all of that and reveal how she emerged as a vibrant and loving person. I didn't understand that her luck was her remarkable capacity to reinvent herself in a way that honored the past, forgot nothing, but forgave a lot for the sake of creating some meaning out of the horror. And I treasure those lessons, particularly now as the world feels as if it's tilting dangerously closer to the world that Clara lived in. It's clear to me that the trauma of the Holocaust and the challenges to faith in the future that European Jews suffered is still felt in the families of its victims and survivors and in the Jewish community at large. Many of us who are 2nd and 3rd generation descendants and who are writers are still writing our World War II stories of escape and survival, because although we may be 1 or 2 generations removed from the events of World War II, we are not removed from their impact on our families and the perceptions in our current lives. Sometimes we are surprised, as I was, to find that there are stories of love and redemption amidst the horror. We want to write these stories now because our parents and grandparents have mostly left us. And with them go the barriers to, but also the bridges to that devastating history. We wish to bring their messages of hope to an unsettled time. As the novelist Nomi Eve stated in an interview about why she writes Jewish historical fiction, she says, "I learned early on that the stories my family shared at my grandmother's Shabbos table were as nourishing as the food that she prepared. Those of us who've been fortunate enough to have heard and been nourished by our family's stories of their lives in Europe feel an urgency to preserve and share them, even in darkness." Okay, so now I'm going to try to turn off. There we go.
There we go.
Hi, Rabbi.
Hi, Barbara. Thank you so very much for helping us at least begin to understand how you came to write this story. I'd like to ask a few questions, but let's begin with what I think is the drama of the book. And without giving away the ending, without a spoiler alert, Clara ends up living with a Catholic priest in Germany for a good deal of her post-war adult life. So tell us something about that relationship.
So the priest was the stepson of Clara's over the backyard fence best friend. The small town that Clara grew up in, she had a very close friend, and that woman married a man who was a widower and had 5 children. One of those children was this priest. And hers was a haven. Her home was a haven for him. He was exactly an age between her 2 sons, and he would come to play. He was sent away to live in an orphanage, even though his father had remarried this woman. For some reason, 4 of the kids got to stay home, but he went off because his aunt was a nun in an orphanage and she raised him. And so she knew him as a child. And then he basically, and again, I don't want to give too much away, but he basically rescued her when she and her husband and her mother were liberated.
So help us again, without giving away the substance of your wonderful book. Tell us a little more about Clara and her attitudes. You mentioned that your grandfather was a proud German. Both families, you said, even when they came to America and they faced the resentment of the community here. But what were Clara's attitudes about Germans, her attitudes about Jews and non-Jews, her feelings, her remembrances of the war, and how she interpreted the experience of the war?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, and it's very hard for me to talk about her attitudes separate from that relationship. So the priest Ansel had a PhD in biblical studies, especially he specialized in Old Testament, and he made sure that, there was a menorah in their dining room. He made sure that she had any part of the Jewish life that she wanted to participate in. She chose not to advertise her Judaism. She didn't hide it, but she didn't advertise it. And she was very supportive of the work that he did. He was a very prominent priest. And her sense was that her spiritual and religious life was firm, but she no longer felt that she needed to go to the synagogue to do that. She died when she was 100, and for the last year of her life, he sat by her bedside and wrote an amazing book called The Kings and Prophets in the Art of Marc Chagall. They had, you should pardon the expression, 7 Chagalls that they got early on, you know, like prints that they got early on. And they were immersed in Jewish history and religion through his religion as much as hers. It was really, it's like nothing else I've ever experienced.
Wow. And what, besides the book that he wrote, and your contact with your aunt, what other connection do you have with him and his, because he sounds like as much a unique character as your aunt.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I am not really close with other Catholic priests, you know, so I have an N of 1, but he is a remarkable Renaissance person. And I mean, that's basically, you know, that's what I can say about him. We do keep contact with him. He's still in Germany and we're all here, but we keep in close contact with him. And he's an amazing man.
Hmm. So your family went to the Theresienstadt concentration camp, which was a unique camp. It was the show camp that the Nazis would use to show the world.
Exactly.
That they weren't as brutal as we know them to have been. And the great terror of Theresienstadt was to be deported from there to Auschwitz or Treblinka.
Yes.
But within the camp, there was this remarkable cultural life. There was an orchestra, there was a theater group, there were, what do you know about the life of the camp from your experience, from your connection with your family?
So I'll give you one example, which is pretty prominent in the book. And it certainly was extremely important to my great aunt. And that is that she became very close with Leo Beck, who, as you know, was also at Theresienstadt. And he was the chief rabbi in Germany before the war. And she became friends with him and was spiritually extremely inspired and comforted by him. And there's a great story which she told me, and then the priest corroborated it, that after the war, when he had long been in England, where he, you know, continued to live after the war, he came to Germany and visited her in the rectory with the priest. You know, they had a nice little tea party with Leo Beck. So that's an example of the kind of, I mean, in these diminished, horrible circumstances. And it's true that it was a show camp, and it's true that they dressed everybody up and fed them and so forth when the Red Cross came, but it was not an easy place. And there were aspects of the camp that were, you know, just as horrible. It's just that all of that is true. And yes, I mean, they were lucky to have been sent there, because I believe that that's one of the reasons why. And there are stories which are in the book of the ways in which, through, again, luck, Clara was able to remove their names from the transport list to Auschwitz.
So you mentioned that your aunt sent 2 children away on a kinder transport, right?
They weren't the famous kinder transport. One of her sons was taken out of Germany through Switzerland down to Trieste in Italy and on a boat to Palestine. And that story appears in the book. Her older son, and this was her son that was 12, her 17-year-old son was able to go to England. They had kind of a worker program where he went and became a landscaper, and he continued to live in England until his death. So
for a moment, I mean, again, without giving away the drama of the book. You're a mom.
I am a
And
mom.
did you cry when you wrote those chapters about a mother sending her kids into a future she had no idea what it would be, into the hands of strangers she had no idea who they would be, and sending them because she had no choice? How does that make a mom feel as she writes those chapters?
Well, I'll tell you, as I said, when I talked about the letters that I translated from this kid, it struck me deeply. It struck me deeply. I've had some experiences, nothing even close to what Clara, but I've had enough traumatic experiences in my own life that it just went right to my heart. It broke my heart to write those, and to translate the letter from my great grandmother was just, yeah, it really got to me as a mom.
So I wonder if I could ask you a few personal questions about your experience now as a storyteller. What does it do to you as a storyteller, taking these stories, which have a side of cruelty and brutality and deep personal pain, and sharing them with the world as a storyteller? How did it change you?
As I think I said earlier, to me, stories are a gift, and to be able to share them is a gift. It's a gift to me, and the experience of having readers tell me what the book meant to them and how it made them feel and how it related to their own life experiences or to their sense of this time in history is so fulfilling. I had this 30-year career as a speech and language therapist, and I thought I was the luckiest person in the world because I loved what I did and I got pretty good at it. And I felt like it was so important. And I was so fortunate to have found that. To find that experience again as a writer has honestly it's been, as we say, a machaya.
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm going to ask you this. I know when I go and teach in places, people will come to me and tell me, you're telling my story. What have readers told you as they've read your book, as they've heard your talk, about their own stories that either parallel or are different from your aunt's story?
So when the book first came out, I was concerned and very sensitive to the fact that this is not your typical Holocaust survival story. This does not fit nicely into the genre. I was a Jewish Book Council author, so I was going around to, congregations and JCCs and book festivals, and I was very sensitive to the fact that this was not necessarily going to feel comfortable for the Jewish community. I worked with that. My father-in-law, who I adored, was a great test case. He was a survivor from Vienna, and he did not approve of anything having to do with Germany at all. But he loved this book, and he felt like it had respectfully told a story without being a sellout. But I did get some pushback, and that I felt like it was my job to handle that and to acknowledge that people had different experiences. What I didn't expect was the outpouring of people I'd never heard of before, people I didn't know, writing reviews on Goodreads and on Amazon and telling me that this had touched them so deeply in exactly the ways that were the reason I wrote it, which is that even in darkness, there can be light, and that we can't control what happens to us, but we have some control over how we try to cope and how we try to position ourselves. And that was the inspiration that I got from Clara and from Ansel. And that is why I wrote the book.
The great psychologist Viktor Frankl, who went to Auschwitz, writes exactly that. We can't control the events that touch us, but we can control how we interpret them, the meaning we draw from them, and the impact they have on our character. And I think that what you discovered is something that all of us who teach this discover, which is it's very easy and very tempting to reduce something as profound as the Holocaust to a simple black and white, good guys and bad guys. There were terrible, evil Germans and innocent victim Jews and bystanders we have contempt for. And what you discovered was nuance. You discovered Germans who had heart. You discovered Jews who had resilience and power, and that neither Germany nor the Jewish experience was complete. They're very complex and very nuanced. Very
That's
complex and
exactly
very
right.
nuanced.
That's
And people have a hard time with that. But I find that people have a hard time that they want to retreat into the black and white. And you present us a character in Ansel who is a German with a deep sense of heart, and your aunt who has a deep sense of resilience and in her powerlessness, great power, great strength.
Yep.
So and I think that's what people appreciate about your work.
It's certainly what people recognize, and it certainly was very fulfilling to experience that, with that being a theme that was so important to me as a writer. And it's a theme that's carried through into my second book in some ways. And it's kind of been part of my marching orders in my own life. So yeah.
Very nice. So I have a question I want to ask you, which will be our last question, but it's the hardest question. And I'll preface it by telling you that I ask everybody this question this week, because this is the week that the Jewish world turns and remembers.
Yep.
They remember the Shoah. They remember the horrors. We commemorate and celebrate the courage and the goodness of those who stood out heroically. But here's the question. As you well know from your own family experience, within a few years, the last of the survivors are going to leave us. And then the story will move from memory to history. And the difference between memory and history is that memory is what somebody tells you I saw. History is something we have to create, like you did, gathering the evidence, gathering the recollections, gathering the letters, gathering the stories, and creating a narrative. So the question is going to be, and again, I'm going to appeal to you both as a teacher and as a storyteller and as a mom. Like I see somebody's bat mitzvah certificate right over your shoulder.
That's fine.
Oh, that's beautiful. Just beautiful. What story shall we tell? What lesson, having spent so much time dealing with this and living with your aunt's story, what lessons shall we tell our children and our children's children about the Holocaust that will help them live in the world?
Wow. What story should we tell?
And what lessons shall we draw?
And what lessons? I mean, there will always be evil, and there will always be situations that we cannot control. But when we can recruit within ourselves and with others that resilience, that whatever power an individual has, whatever love and devotion and resilience, that's the best we can do. And there are many, many, many stories of that. I love the book where they went and asked the Dalai Lama, you guys are now in a diaspora. And he took a bunch of Jewish rabbis and said, what is it that's the key? And they all looked at him and said, it's the Seder. It's the telling of the story. And so if we keep telling the story that over our history, there's always evil, there's always struggle, there's power, but what is it that's victorious? And it is, to me, that's the answer. It's that love and devotion and resilience.
I want to thank you for spending this evening with us. And to all of us who are watching and listening, I want to thank Barbara Stark-Nemon for her wonderful story. Here's the book. It's a marvelous book. It's called Even in Darkness. It's a terrific read, and it's an inspiring story to share with those you love on this Yom HaShoah, because it's an inspiration. It lifts you up out of the darkness. And these days we can use all the lift up that all of us can find. So thank you so very, very much for sharing your story. Thank you to Debbie Posner, your cousin, for bringing you to us. I'm only sorry that you couldn't visit our community in person.
I'll have to do it another time because I was really looking forward to it.
And you would have loved it because it was a very warm and sunny day today. You would have enjoyed it.
It's 22 in Michigan.
It's 72 in Los Angeles.
Oh.
Come visit. And to Deborah Goldberger and the leadership of the Valley Beth Shalom Sisterhood, our dearest thanks for presenting tonight's program. To Orit Rappaport, who produced tonight's program, and to all who have shared this with us tonight, we wish you a very, very good night. And thank you for watching. Good night. Barbara, thanks so much. Very good.
Lila Tov to everyone.
Good night. Orit?